The Indian people have enjoyed many of the appurtenances of a functioning federal parliamentary democracy for over 60 years, with local self-government for over 40. Large sections of the Indian people have sanctified these processes with their participation. And I am able to stand here before you because our Supreme Court granted me bail after I was convicted of sedition, rich medieval word, by the trial court, and after the Chhattisgarh High Court refused to grant me bail. Yet when we look around at the vast masses of our own people, it seems that all these political instrumentalities provide no recourse, no remedy. I would like to place 3 examples before you to illustrate this bitter truth. The first concerns hunger. Going by the government surveys of anthropometric data, such as the body mass index, large sections of our people are living through a chronic, stable famine. Releasing a report on childhood malnutrition, Dr. Manmohan Singh called it a, quote, national shame, unquote, that close to half our children are malnourished by objective, internationally accepted criteria. What many do not know is that 37% of our adult population, men and women, have a body mass index below 18.5, which signifies chronic undernutrition. This 37% includes over 50% of scheduled tribes, over 60% of scheduled castes, and large proportions of our minority populations. Such high levels of chronic undernutrition form a deadly toxic combination with infectious diseases like tuberculosis and malaria because of the reduction in the levels of nutrition that these people enjoy, because of the reduction in the levels of immunity that these people enjoy from other infections. Deadly toxic combination with infectious diseases like tuberculosis and malaria, and makes childbearing a hazardous prospect. The World Health Organization says that any community that has more than 40% of its members with a body mass index below 18.5 should be considered a community in famine. When this reflects back onto the data that we already have from the National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau, which is a government organization, vast sections of the people of India are living permanently in a state of famine. What is more, the latest National Sample Survey data, NSS data from 2009-2010 series, show that over time, grain consumption is declining. The grain consumption that poor people are able to afford, the amount of grain that they consume, is declining over time. So we not only have a famine on our hands, but the famine is getting worse as the days pass by. In response to this, I belong to the People's Union for Civil Liberties. The People's Union of Civil Liberties is in turn a member of the Right to Food campaign, which is a coalition, national coalition of organizations that is trying to bring about changes in the policies regarding food and nutrition that cover our country. And we have been asking for the universalization of the public distribution system. Instead, in fact, the public distribution system itself is, the current shape is a product of a 10-year writ that is being heard in the Supreme Court, PUCL versus Union of India, which the Union of India, the lawyers representing Union of India, have decided to fight in a non-confrontational manner, so that both the sides are actually trying to get an improvement in the current situation. And a lot of the current public distribution system policies are a result of the Supreme Court judgment, the interim judgments of the Supreme Court in this People's Union PUCL case. So we have reached a certain position with the public distribution system. Now we have a food security bill that takes us several steps backward from where we have already reached. Instead of improving the situation, the food security bill, the proposed food security bill, which is now before the Standing Committee of Parliament, takes us back. And when, on the 14th of December, there was a cabinet meeting regarding the food security bill to be introduced in Parliament, Mr. Sharad Pawar is reported to have said, in response to this demand for universalization of PDS, is reported to have said in the press that the government could not take responsibility for feeding every mouth in the event of a famine. This is tantamount to Marie Antoinette's "let them eat cake." I mean, it's just as bad. On the other hand, the Planning Commission has submitted an affidavit to the Supreme Court in the same PUCL case, stating that the ICMR, Indian Council for Medical Research, their recommendations, 2,400 calories per day for ordinary people, 2,100 calories per day for people leading sedentary lives, these are the norms that have held till now. Those norms no longer hold, and the Planning Commission is going to be regarding 1,800 calories per day, which is a starvation diet, in my opinion, as the normal recommended dietary intake for the day. These deprived communities, these communities which have these low levels of caloric intake, which are living in a permanent state of famine, these deprived communities are able to survive because of their access to common property resources, to an ecological niche that they occupy. Resistance to displacement is the key to survival. And across the country, under the doctrine of eminent domain, natural resources are being expropriated by corporate hegemonic elites with the state as guarantor by peaceful means where possible, by force of arms where necessary. The third example, and the resistance to displacement is quelled under a huge panoply of laws, sedition and AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, among them, specially designed to circumscribe and restrict the civil liberties guaranteed to us under our Constitution. Thousands of men and women, even their numbers are not known properly, are languishing in prisons across the country, their voices unheard, those responsible for jailing them protected under absolute impunity. This phenomenon has many names today: Kudankulam, Jaitpur, POSCO, Vedanta, and almost the entire Northeast. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Northeast. At a time when the critique of large dam construction has been proved correct even in relatively seismically stable areas, and worse yet, there is strong evidence that storage lakes can produce earthquakes in seismologically active areas, how can such a demented, vast program of hydropower construction be imposed from the center? The center is imposing hundreds of dams on the Northeast, destroying this will not only displace huge populations, but huge areas of forest are going to be destroyed in the Northeast. Resources, this phenomenon has many names: Kudankulam, Jaitpur, POSCO, Vedanta, and almost the entire Northeast among them. Resources enough for all our needs, but never enough for anyone's greed. The practice of democracy is too important to be outsourced to one set of people every so many years. Even if 1/3 of them didn't have to face major criminal charges, even if all of them, barring a few, weren't millionaires, the sovereignty of citizens cannot be delegated except for certain limited purposes, such as for the convenience of governance. Democracy has to mean, and has to be made to mean, governance by common consent, governance by consent of the common citizen. Anything less, and we will have a catastrophe on our hands. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Ms. Maliha Lodhi. She is the former Pakistan ambassador to the United States and also the former Pakistan High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. But that's not the only hat that she wears. She is also a journalist, a professor, an academician, and an author. And in fact, she's also written about how the middle class in Pakistan perhaps holds the key in resolving the situation that Pakistan finds itself in. It is citizen activism that she advocates across the border. Maliha Lodhi.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank India Today for inviting me. It's the first time I've attended and spoken at the conclave, and I hope it won't be the last. So let me say that obviously this panel is about India, but I will speak about my country, Pakistan. And let me start by saying that this is a time of great challenge for Pakistan. There are many daunting problems that the country faces as it navigates a critical transition from military rule to civilian democracy. But as it navigates these very complex challenges, it is also a moment of exciting political change in Pakistan. We are witnessing a rebalancing of power between different state institutions as democratization gathers pace and as different political actors and state institutions seek to find their place in this transition. There is not so much a clash of institutions going on in Pakistan as the headlines would have you believe, but more a renegotiation and reconfiguration of power within the political system. And this is happening in a very transparent way. But let me turn to the real topic of this panel, which is that in Pakistan, the old power structure, the civilian and military establishment, is under challenge. It is under challenge from the emergence of several countervailing forces, an activist judiciary, a free and energetic media, and a growing civil society. And this new environment is recasting the relationship between state and citizen, between the citizen and the way the government governs. It is changing the expectations people have of their government. This political landscape is in a fluid condition, and it is opening up space and offering unprecedented opportunities for citizen activism. The new political terrain is also marked by the rise of a larger, more assertive urban middle class, which wants a bigger political voice, and it wants a more efficient, transparent, and responsive state. I think, and I've written about this, the Imran Khan phenomena reflects this and explains his emergence as a symbol of hope for many Pakistanis. But as he's not here, I don't speak on his behalf, so let me carry on. I think the confluence of some of these factors that I've just described, together with the rapid expansion of television networks and the advent of the digital age, is triggering the kind of dynamics that are making possible efforts to limit the exercise of executive power or the excesses of executive power. This is strengthening the structures of democratic accountability, and it also holds out the prospect of a transformation in the way Pakistan has governed itself. I think, as we heard so eloquently yesterday from Anwar Ibrahim, democracy is denuded of substance if it is not anchored in the rule of law, if it doesn't have the checks and balances that makes rulers accountable to the ruled. And democracy is as much about what happens between elections than what happens on election day. In Pakistan, some of these dynamics that I have just described first expressed themselves in a politically significant way in the lawyers' movement 4 years ago, which also foreshadowed new forms of citizen engagement in political action. We remember from the last few years that the lawyers' movement saw months of sustained demonstrations, street action by citizens, and by members of civil society, and of course, unprecedented media coverage in support of the judges who had been ousted by President Musharraf. 4 months of protest by this coalition, informal coalition of groups and citizens, became a movement to advance, defend, and advocate the rule of law. This led the Supreme Court to rule that the sacked judges should be restored. And then we saw a second phase of this movement, which forced President Zardari to reinstate the Chief Justice and his colleagues. And although this campaign had a single-point agenda, it reflected wider liberal democratic aspirations and was spearheaded by middle-class professionals, with politicians following, not leading, this urban upsurge. I think the stars of successful political activism were well and truly aligned. And in many respects, this set the stage for the citizen activism that we are witnessing today. The interplay or the intersection between a newly empowered judiciary, a vigorous media, and citizen activism is one filling a void in existing formal systems of accountability, forcing a reluctant establishment and political elite to be more transparent in the way they govern the country. And secondly, this is compensating for inaction by status quo-oriented political parties. I think what this is doing in a very mutually reinforcing way is to encourage the emergence of a new form of democratic politics, or what can be called citizen accountability. A virtuous cycle has been coming into play, with citizens taking their case to the media, often media mounting pressure on the judiciary, and then the judiciary's willingness to take quick action or at times suo motu action, which in turn is encouraging others to mount similar challenges. In a way, all of this has been made possible by technology, which has empowered individual citizens and made society more connected. I think the social media, 24/7 television, digital technology have all generated a new sense of public awareness in Pakistan and empowerment. And this is being expressed in greater demands for public accountability. In a way, public mobilization has gone viral. So no longer does an incident of injustice at the hands of a local landlord or the police in some remote part of the country remain local. It often tends to get covered by the media, or there is a citizen action that takes place and the court responds. Let me cite 3 or 4 very recent examples to illustrate the point. And they all show, one way or the other, how the establishment or members of the establishment are being brought to heel. The latest involved a member of the ruling party from an influential feudal family in Sindh who was contesting a by-election to the provincial assembly. A citizen and the media captured the candidate slapping and assaulting a female polling officer with the police just standing by and looking, not daring to stop this person in deference to her local influence. But the moment this video was broadcast, there was a fierce public outcry. A citizen filed a petition, the Supreme Court acted, and the Election Commission was obliged to annul the results of this by-election and also to disqualify the candidate from holding elected office for 2 years. This instant justice left the ruling party, which was reluctant to act against this person. In fact, one member of the ruling party even said on television, this happens all the time. You know, there's a lot of slapping that goes on at polling stations. Well, this was a slap too far. And this led to the kind of action which I think is going to be an example to others. It's a powerful signal that has been sent to others. Another recent incident involved the cold-blooded shooting by paramilitary personnel in Karachi's restless streets when a group of criminals were rounded up. But again, it was the media and a bystander together took a video from their cell phone, took it to the media, it was shown on television, and of course, there was again a public outcry. The justices of the Supreme Court insisted that the head of the Rangers make himself available in court to explain this conduct, and this led to the punishment of the perpetrators of this atrocity. A third case, now these are cases of just the last 2 or 3 months, involved a female parliamentarian of the ruling party in Pakistan's largest province, the Punjab. Again, this was caught on CCTV. She was using a stolen credit card to buy jewelry. She was exposed. The party of the Punjab was reluctant to take any action, but was forced to do that, and she also lost her seat in the assembly. And a more recent case, just a few days ago, was of a former MPA at whose behest a local school teacher was beaten up. Again, this was exposed and action was taken very quickly. Now, in all these cases, frankly, nothing would have happened if it hadn't been for citizen activism, the media's exposure, and the omnipresence of an activist judiciary. And I have to say, these are not isolated incidents. I have just chosen these of the last 2 or 3 months. They're among a growing number that are putting the establishment under pressure and creating a new form of citizen-driven accountability. Among the many cases going on right now as I speak, in the Supreme Court, is how an intelligence agency distributed public funds to politicians to influence elections back in 1990. This would have gone unheard. In fact, it did go unheard for 2 decades, but it's now being heard. I don't want to suggest, by any stretch of the imagination, that these trends are about to dislodge the current, present, existing political establishment and military establishment from their entrenched positions. But they're putting them on notice and signaling that it can no longer be business as usual. And it's opening up opportunities to realign governance with public purpose. It is shaking traditional elites out of their smug, accountable to no one postures, forcing faded and jaded political parties to respond to public aspirations. And of course, it is strengthening the structures of democratic accountability. It's also exposing the increasing mismatch between patronage-based, stagnant politics and the demands of a changing and a dynamic society for modern, efficient, and accountable governance. I think this is making Pakistan part of a global trend. It's nothing unusual. This is happening across the world as we go through an era of unprecedented transparency, which has been brought about by the revolution in information communication technology. This, as we know, is generating what some people have called global angst, a popular disenchantment with elites across the world. We witnessed this in the Occupy Wall Street movement in the US. The Arab Spring, in many ways, reflects this, the protests in Russia, and elsewhere, protests against the status quo. And I think what I heard for the first time from Anna Hazare yesterday gives me a sense of what is happening in your country. So really, this is now a worldwide phenomena where citizens are saying it's not enough to elect those we put in power, but we want to know what they deliver to us, the people. So let me end by saying that the question is whether the new forms of political activism and citizen accountability in Pakistan can assume a more organized shape and coalesce with other emerging trends to become a vehicle and a catalyst for wide-ranging and much-needed systemic reform in Pakistan. In other words, can these changes create the basis for my country to govern itself better? I think the real test of whether this will have a transformational impact is if it is able to change the patronage basis of politics and move it away from family, clan, dynasties, hereditary politics, towards what the citizens of Pakistan increasingly want: genuine empowerment, a system based on meritocracy, and a system which also professionalizes government decision-making and delivers to the people what their aspirations are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lodhi. Can I please request our next speaker onto the lectern now, Ms. Brinda Karat. She is a CPM Politburo member. She's been a politician for 40 years, like she just disclosed. But also she's been a very active activist. She, again, has played a variety of roles. It's not just labor unions that she's worked with, but she's also spoken out very strongly for women's rights. When the question of the Women's Reservation Bill came up, she was one of the leading faces in Parliament to push for the bill. And she's worked on issues as diverse as accompanying the grandparents of 2 children who were held back by the Norwegian childcare authorities. She took them to the president. She went from door to door asking that those children be brought back. So a variety of issues that she has agitated on. Ms. Brinda Karat, can I please request you to come here?
Thank you so much. Fellow panelists and ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here and to be given this opportunity to share a few thoughts on what I think is a very relevant issue in this discussion today. I mean, when we think about a nation century, very ambitious idea, and we look at our own country and the possibilities of India really developing into a very significant power, not in the sense of a power in a negative sense, but a power for the people of this country, then there are, I think, certain issues which do need to be cleansed. And I think that the role of citizens in the cleansing process is very critical. I think it's very few people today would question the role of citizen activism, particularly after the last year's experience in the campaign against corruption. So I don't really think there can be much disagreement on the role of citizen activism. The only thing is that in our country, I'm not sure whether those in power recognize that or not. Because what we have seen in the last year, just on the issue of corruption and the role of the government, the central government in dealing or addressing the issues which were raised, I think that there is a non-recognition of the rights of citizens of this country to speak. I mean, today if we talk about, and we are proud that we have a strong parliamentary democratic system, but if today it is posed that there is a law pending in Parliament, and if citizens outside India want to intervene in the process of what that law should consist of, and if they organize dharnas or strikes or hunger strikes, then that in a way is seen as pitting citizens against Parliament. I think that weakens democracy and our democratic system, and it narrows it down to the 542 honorable members of Parliament. So I think the attitude towards citizens' activism, I think we do still need a much further clarity on that as far as the government and also many parliamentarians. I mean, if we feel, I was in Parliament at that time, and I know that there was real anger among a section of parliamentarians that who are these people trying to tell us what we know best, which is how to make laws? I mean, I'm sure they may know best, but the fact is that there are also other people who have their own opinions, and they have every right to be on the streets. So, and we saw that even more recently in the Kudamkulam incident, where, I mean, I was surprised and also I was a bit saddened by the fact that the Prime Minister of the country thought it necessary to make accusations against those who were involved in that struggle, accusing them of being agents of America. I mean, this is a government which is including FDI in every single sphere, but if there's a coincidence of views between certain environmental groups in America and anti-nuclear power activists in India, I hardly think that it's a very democratic way to accuse them of taking money. I mean, I personally am against the non-transparency as far as foreign-funded NGOs are concerned. But my point is that where there is citizens' activism, and if those in power do not recognize it as being part of a democratic process, then I do believe that Indian democracy itself is weakened. The second point that I would like to make is that I'm not sure I agree with the understanding that it is only citizens' activism which can clean up India. I mean, even if you look at corruption, and I was really struck by many of the examples given by Maliha, because there are so many parallels here. Just very recently in some of our elections also we found a lot of this going on, and that was also exposed by the TV cameras. But the point that I want to make is that when you look at corruption, it is, of course, easy to say all politicians are corrupt, and here are the examples of A, B, C, D. And this has a sort of resonance among a section of people, and particularly the educated middle class who have their own ideas of what politics should be. And certainly, I think this has just become a sort of a brush on all politics and all politicians, but who benefits by this? Who benefits, and what is the way out? If you're going to say that all politics and all politicians are corrupt, well, what are we looking at then? Are we looking at a dictatorship? Or are we looking at an authoritarian regime? So the politics is essential to clean up society. You need clean politics to clean up society. And any ideology which seeks to pit a very, very honest civil society or citizens with a bracket of corrupt politicians, I don't think we're going to clean up much. I do believe that we have had some very major advances precisely because of the very popular and very effective struggles led by Anna Hazareji. And I salute that struggle. But I certainly don't agree. By using that platform to promote an idea that politics has no place or politicians have no place in taking this country forward. I also believe that it's easy when you talk about corruption to target an individual. And of course you must. If A, B, or C are known to have made crores and crores of rupees looting this country's resources, and there's evidence of it, most definitely they have to go to jail, and that has to be the focus, and that is what we have been fighting for, the fact that governments don't act and you have to wait for the courts to act. So that is important. But by just limiting a struggle to just 1 or 2 or 10 or 12 corrupt people, what is it? What are the policies which are driving that corruption? What are the policies which create an environment that ye sab theek hai, sab chalta hai? I believe that there is a very disturbing trend in Indian politics today. And I know many of you belong to corporates or run very successful businesses most honestly. So I am not talking about all businesses or all corporates, but certainly there is a very strong trend today of a sort of like a toxic nexus between corporates, a section of bureaucracy, and those in power, some of those in power. And unless we look at the kind of policies and politics which are promoting this kind of crony capitalism, an environment where earlier we used to talk about the corruption of the license raj and say, "Arey, ye to license ke liye ye suitcase bhar ke lekar aate hain." But today, whole ministries are being sold. And they're being sold in the name of a non-licensed liberalized society. So you do have to look and see that in the anxiety to promote the so-called democracy of the market, are we not also creating an environment with these policies in which there is no accountability. And I believe that in the fight against corruption, a fatal flaw has been the lack of any significant scrutiny of the way that this nexus is working. And I believe to do that, you need good politics. So we must have citizenship, we must have a transparent citizen activism, but unless that is linked to and joined with clean politics and good politics and political parties, I think it is going to be a limited endeavor, a good endeavor, a very good, necessary endeavor, but it's going to be limited because you're not looking at the basic policy issue. And my final point is that when we talk about the Asian century and we talk about cleansing India, I mean, I associate myself with what Dr. Binayak has said about fighting inequalities and cleansing India of these obscene inequalities that we see today. But I also would like to share with you some of the experiences that I have had in, say the last 4 to 5 years in looking at women's issues. On the issue of caste, we feel proud to say that, Arey dekho, we are so modern now. I mean, where's caste? There's no caste, has disappeared. This is all propaganda against India. When some Dalit activists went to the UN and wanted to raise the issue of Dalit oppression and discrimination, they were told that, this just doesn't happen. This is all hearsay. Our government representative there said, this is all hearsay, so we cannot accept it. But it's real, it's true. Even now, roti and beti. Now, roti ka to फिर भी कुछ हम आगे बढ़े हैं. अभी तो सब जाके फोटो कैमरा लेकर हम लोग जाके बैठते हैं और दलितों के घर में खाना वाना खा के आ जाते हैं. तो ये तो है, रोटी का फिर भी कुछ आगे बढ़े हैं, लेकिन बेटी का कहीं नहीं बढ़े हैं. And I tell you, and I feel so awful about this, that the most educated people, if their girl, if their daughter happens to fall in love with a person considered of a lower caste, I can tell you the kind of violence that child faces. And it's in Delhi, and it's all around Delhi. And it's not just these crazy khap panchayats, because you can just brush it aside and say, "Arey, ye to khap panchayat hai." But it's there, it's real, it's true. We have documented something like 142 different types of discrimination against Dalits. And one of the most astounding things which was documented in a town in Tamil Nadu, that there were 2 lanes, one a Dalit lane, one a non-Dalit lane. And in the Dalit lane, they had male dogs. And the male dogs used to cross over and go to the non-Dalit areas, and they used to, mate, and little puppies were born. And this was considered a highly insulting practice. And therefore, for the last so many years in that area, in those lanes, no Dalit household is allowed to have a male dog. I mean, why I'm giving you this? Because it's symbolic of what is real in India today. And if you, and if those who have an education, unless we become vocal and fight this out, we are into this thing about reservation and jobs and, but look at what the reality is. How can you cleanse India unless you cleanse India of this evil which exists? We have to. And this is linked to so many other areas of women's oppression. Caste is a very critical factor. If we talk about a nation's century, you have to get rid of this. And to get rid of this, you need much more activism on it. And I'm sorry to say that today, civil society or citizens, or the support that civil society and citizens need to give to some of the more fundamental issues, it's just not happening. And therefore, we can have citizens against corruption because that, that is important. I don't want to deny that. But there are other areas of citizenship which do need to be voiced, and I'm sure, I'm positive, that there are more and more voices, especially among young people who experience these things too, who will really stand up and help to cleanse India and our society of these various inequalities which exist. I thank you again for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Karat, giving plenty of food for thought about how Jan Lokpal is not the only issue before civil society where activism is needed. There are plenty more and more serious things that need immediate attention. And finally, I would like to request Mr. Salman Khurshid. You know him as the Minister for Law and Justice and also for Minority Affairs, but you also know him as someone who was the face of the government during the Jan Lokpal deliberations. So it's all yours.
Good afternoon to all of you, very distinguished panelists. I go last, and that's usually a disadvantage. It's an advantage, of course, because I have a chance to respond to what my colleagues have just said. I want to begin with a caveat as far as, although I speak on my own behalf, but since I'm part of government, I can't entirely separate myself from the responsibility that I have in government. But I must say very categorically, I think on behalf of government as well as on my own behalf, a caveat that as far as we are concerned, we have no hesitation and no reservation in accepting that there is an exceptionally important, legitimate role for civil society in a democracy. It may be discomforting for us from time to time. It may be questioning our motives. It may be questioning our capacity, questioning our integrity. But I think that's an essential part of democracy. And if it makes democracy stronger, it makes democracy more enlightened, it makes democracy more effective, and increases the outreach of democracy and the depth of democracy, it means little that it is to us in some way not personally beneficial or collectively beneficial. But of course, it doesn't mean that there's a carte blanche that we would give to anyone in any matter. These are all issues of dialogue, negotiated dialogue, presentation of one's own experience and understanding, and from thesis and antithesis and the emergence of a synthesis in due course. And it's not that it would be just one government that does it. A succession of governments would do it. And at what point of time would you be able to feel that you have actually succeeded in achieving a milestone is something that you will judge periodically every year here at the India Today Conclave. Dr. Binayak Sen made, I believe, a very interesting, very sensitive, and a very insightful presentation on his understanding and his experience of what I call the other side of the mountain, very important other side of the mountain. But let me just say one very significant thing, because he spoke of his being here today, because he has bail from the Supreme Court. Let me just take that theme up for a moment, also link it with what Maliha Lodhi ji said about the remarkable role that the judiciary has played in her country, and certainly to underscore the remarkable role that the judiciary has played in our country in many forms. There may be many, many issues that one feels a little uncomfortable about, institutional, structural issues, not conceptual issues necessarily. But we do want to underscore the point, and I had the good fortune to speak to Dr. Binayak Sen when we were waiting to come in here. And I said to him that people have, generally that I have spoken to, missed a very, very significant part of the judgment that gave him his liberty. And I think he reflected for a moment to regurgitate that judgment. And that judgment, although only about interim bail, and it's not conclusive, it's not final, but for those who have watched the Supreme Court carefully and have studied the work of the Supreme Court carefully, and who might even have felt periodically disappointed that the Supreme Court, after some historic judgments on liberty, coming after the last era of disquiet the Supreme Court felt during the emergency, hasn't given us an outstanding conceptual judgment on liberty. Releasing somebody from prison and giving somebody bail is nothing unusual for a court, leave aside the Supreme Court. But in his case, if I remember correctly, the Supreme Court specifically said that you cannot punish a person for their thoughts. Now that, for those common lawyers here, is a very simple thought. It's something that you've grown up on, that you cannot punish a person for their thoughts. Indeed, in an enlightened, in a growing democracy, you should encourage people for their thoughts, not punish them for their thoughts. But it took the Supreme Court a very, very important case against the trend that one had seen all the way from the High Court. It took the Supreme Court a very important case to make this pronouncement. Very soon thereafter, in another area that has become extremely clouded with both convictions, prejudices, lack of information, political disquiet, political disagreements, in the bail matter in the 2G series of cases, it was Justice Dattu's judgment in the Supreme Court, where going back to the root of the judgments given in the time of Justice Bhagwati and Justice Krishna Iyer, Justice Dattu, on behalf of the Supreme Court, said that bail is the rule and jail is exception. And bail, then he explained, is only for the purposes of ensuring that the person who is placed on trial or charged or is to answer charges is available for trial. That's all. He said very categorically that incarceration, punishment before trial is unacceptable in the Indian system. And this judgment, I believe, is again a landmark judgment, except that it pursues and follows many, many judgments given for 30 years. And it took the Supreme Court several months before the Supreme Court could actually give this judgment to the country. How this judgment is then applied by a series of courts across the country is another matter. But why am I saying this? I'm saying, one, to recognize that in our country, everything is not dark and everything is not to be condemned, that in the very institutions that somehow you at times feel distressed about are these sparks of genius and sparks of enormous foresight and enormous depth that give us a tremendous sense of satisfaction. But the issue essentially is a problem of conceptual clarity. And that's what I link with the role of civil society in our country. One is conceptual clarity. And conceptual clarity, as far as civil society, or for that matter, any institution or any wing of government or any part of our society is concerned, must go back essentially to the root of conceptual clarity about democracy. There is disagreement on every issue in our country today. There would be a disagreement on many issues here in your gathering. And disagreement is part of democracy. Dissent is essential to good democracy. But in every democracy, there are rules for resolving disagreement and rules for taking into account and factoring in dissent, and then providing for dissent, and then turning dissent into a synthesis or into an agreement. There are disagreements in courts as well. People often say that far-reaching, far-sighted dissents of yesterday become the leading judgments of today. And I was saying very outside that we have a judgment that a lot of people consider to be an extremely retrograde judgment of some of the best judges of this country. And that's the judgment of SDM Jabalpur. That's the habeas corpus judgment during the emergency. The present Supreme Court, outside the Supreme Court, those very outstanding judges, including two of them who went on to become Chief Justices, and one in very recent years, after reaching a very, very advanced age of perhaps 85, another soon after retirement from the Supreme Court, had said that they felt that they had given the wrong judgment. But today, sitting judges of the Supreme Court have said that the Supreme Court, too, by its judgments, can violate fundamental rights of the Indian citizen. Now, that kind of jurisprudence is not seen anywhere in the world. Those judgments have not been reversed yet. Just as I said, the judgment of Lady Chatterley's lover has not been reversed by the Supreme Court. But talk to any Supreme Court judge and they'll probably tell you that that's a wrong judgment. Now, can you, when you have a Supreme Court where people are trained and understand what disagreements are and also know how to move from disagreements, those of you who are not familiar with the Indian Supreme Court, and I think Malia Lodhiji, you will be interested in this, every court, highest court in the country, in the world, has power to review its judgments. They were bound by precedents in the UK 30 years ago. They said in exceptional cases, we will not follow precedents, we can depart from precedents. Indian Supreme Court is the only Supreme Court that not only provides for a provision of review, but also provides for something called a curative petition, where a larger bench of 5 judges, including the judges who've given the judgment in the first place, come together to decide whether the law as decided by the court should be reversed, changed, or modified. Therefore, if we have, even in the highest court of the land, scope for disagreement, and disagreement of such an extreme kind, and rules for disagreement, do we not need rules for disagreement in a democracy as well? Is it that in democracy only the Supreme Court judges can make mistakes, but civil society cannot make mistakes? Is it that parliamentarians cannot make mistakes? Is it that ministers cannot make mistakes? Mistakes that are made can and should be reviewed, can and should be modified, can and should be overruled, but there must be some rules to do this. And the question that we face today is particularly when Brinda Karaji says that we haven't learned the establishment, to which I consider her to be part of the establishment, even if it's on the left side of the establishment. But the establishment hasn't learned from the experience of the anti-corruption movement last year is not true. We have learned. We've learned a lot, but there's possibly a lot to learn. The only question is, has the anti-corruption movement also learned something? Something for them to learn, to understand how existing systems work and how rules of disagreement, if they don't exist, have to be created. It's very important because, go back to democracy. Please reflect for a moment. Democracy is not only about numbers. Even if you can explain that of the total percentage of people who are entitled to vote, a very good vote takes you to 70% of those people voting, and less than 30% are the people who vote for somebody who comes into power. And the person or the government or the people who come into power, the party that comes into power, then gives an impression that they have actually swept with 90% or 95% of people supporting them. I call this a wrong and inaccurate approximation of people's preferences. And I also add to this the idea of celebration of people's preferences that are taken for granted. In celebration, you increase impression that you have from 30% to 90% of the support of the people, whereas even a landslide victory gives you only 30% of the support of the people. Often, a larger number of people continue to oppose you when you've just come as heroes saying that I have swept the polls. At that time also, a majority of people are opposing you. So the question then remains that our inputs into the establishment Are they being prevented by our insensitivity towards civil society, our inability to understand the role of civil society, our inability and incapacity to adjust to the changing methodology of civil society, the technology of civil that is now available to civil society? Or is there a fundamental flaw in our electoral system? If we had proportional representation in the country, would we be better off than first past the post? If we had followed the South African example, where the problem of first past the post would have led into a new kind of apartheid in South Africa, and therefore they moved to proportional representation that over 114 countries in the world have, would we have been better off? It's not an easy answer. They're very, very difficult questions. Our founding fathers must have considered it, and we can research this issue and then come to a conclusion that this is not an easy answer for a country like India. But I do believe that some of the questions about inability to factor in what marginalized people, their leaders, that activists, social activists feel being left out of the system, would it not be better addressed if we have a different system? Now, we don't have that system. And we also don't have the system of referendum. And in election, there are two kinds of preferences. In any exercise of preferences, there are two kinds of preferences. One preference is what you call an internal preference. I want something for myself, and that's my preference. If largest number of voters agree with what I want, and they want the same thing, then we have a majority, and we get that subject, of course, to the rights that we've given to the minority in the Constitution of India. But there are also things called external preferences. And those of you who've traveled during the discount days on American Airlines know that some tickets were sold with an assurance that they would be more expensive than the other discounted tickets, but the assurance given to you was that you would not be sitting next to a passenger who got a discounted ticket. And this works in the American economy. Now, external preferences are not things that you want for yourself, but things you don't want the other person to have. Now, in Indian democracy, there are a lot of people who vote to say others must not have this, and a lot of people who vote to say we must have this. And how do you factor those two in terms of what the people's preference is? And this also holds good for civil society. At least in an institutionalized system, you have a chance through parliament, you have a chance through committees of parliament, you have a chance through debates of this kind to somehow sift the external preference from an internal preference. But when you come to civil society, how do you sift the internal preference from an external preference? How do you take one civil society group to be more important than another civil society group? And the more we rely upon civil society groups, as we must and we need to, we will end up with conflict between civil society groups. So conflict resolution rules will be required there as well. Dissent, disagreement rules will be required there as well. I can only think of, from my days of college, an outstanding American professor called John Rawls, who's no longer alive, who worked on the theory of justice, and whose idea of testing rules was by saying, put yourself in a room in a position of total ignorance about what you will have in life for yourself, and then sit down and work on rules that would be the best rational rules for society that you will finally go and live in. The rich and the poor will not know what their outcomes will be in society. The majority and minority would not know what their outcomes in society would be. People would not know what their attributes would be. People would not know what their talents will be. And then if you sit in society, he says, if you sit in a original position in a dark room, cut off from the rest of the world, you will end up with two basic principles of justice in which he puts liberty on a very high scale, but says that liberty can be curtailed or be exchanged for the least advantaged people, that you can curtail liberty only where the curtailment of liberty will give the maximum advantage to the least advantaged people in society. There may be other tests as well. This is just in passing one such test. But there may be other similar tests as well. And so when we speak of judiciary, we speak of media, we speak of civil society, changing perceptions as they are in Pakistan, and I believe in our country as well. So when Malia Lodhi speaks of Pakistan, she's not speaking of Pakistan alone, because no man is an island by himself. You speak for India just as much, and when we speak of India, we speak just as much of Pakistan, because there are shared institutions. Our experiences may have been different. Our the limits of toleration may be different, but we share experiences, and there is much to learn from you, as indeed I hope that there is something for us to teach to you. But judiciary has some rules of accountability, disagreement and disengagement. What does the media and civil society have? How are we going to work on those rules that will ensure that, that there isn't a mismatch in expectations and institutional stability? Now, of course, there are some very important issues of development and livelihood. Their traditional lives and lives that change because there are larger national goals. There are issues about how much are you prepared to give for your society. People who lay down their life fighting on the border, and then we fight for 15 days or 30 days, and then we get together on a round table and then we make peace. What about their parents? What about their children? Do they say that, did we fight and give our lives because you would then be able to come in a 5-star hotel and discuss peace? Has anybody, any soldier on either side of the border ever said this? Ever any mother of a soldier ever said this? No, because that's a sacrifice they make for greater good of their society, of their country, of their people. And we, in gratitude, say that they gave their lives so that we can live and our children can live in peace. But those are very, very fundamental questions. It's very easy to stand up and say, you have no business to make peace when I have lost my life and I have lost my son. But we do, and we say, let's get on, because he would not have wanted more people to lose their lives. So there are rules of conflict resolution, there are rules of review, there are rules of absorption, there are rules of disengagement, and I think all this is something that, frankly, civil society and media have to take into account as they become participants in the larger game of democracy, which truly, I agree, must be just as much between elections, in fact, more between elections than it is during election time. People often say that revolution eats its children, and we've known that to happen many times over in the world. My worry is not about revolution eating its children, but my recent experience in India of revolutions of the kind that we have seen. Of course, there haven't been sweeping revolutions that we've read about in history, but my worry and greater worry is the children eating the revolution. Very soon after a revolution takes place and we celebrate it, we begin to take pieces off that resolution, and we see very little left of that revolution. So the important thing is accountability. There are societies that can withstand challenge. Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring maybe, the Russian episodes, Green Party, the emergence of the Green movement, an anti-nuclear movement in the United States of America and in Europe. Does it intrinsically and equally effectively apply to us? And I must say that it's an interesting convergence of new ideologies. Just as there is a convergence in modern politics of new feudalism, there is also convergence of new ideologies, that the Indian NGO and the American NGO has a common cause, but Indian political parties and American political parties must not have a common cause. That's an interesting development, but I think we will have to see that as we go along. And lastly, the whole issue of social mobility. We are the ones who have to answer, politicians have to answer this most often, social mobility, and even the civil society questions us on lack of social mobility and opening up. And our leaders, my young leader, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, has often spoken of the Congress needing to open its doors to young people, new generations, new people who've not thought of politics or governance or of public life, open the doors to them so that they can come and make a career in serving the nation. And certainly, many of us and all of us are trapped in the issue of social mobility. But it's a larger question, surely. It's not just a question of lack of social mobility in politics. It's the same about law, it's the same about sports, it's the same about the media, it's the same about Bollywood, it's the same about the medical profession, it's the same about accountancy, probably the same about India today. That we do go from generation to generation as a consequence of how India has developed in the decades since independence. Possibly, this is only the first phase of maturity of our political economy. Possibly, the next stage will be different. Possibly, from within ourselves, there will be revolutionaries born that will reject what the previous generation holds out to them. Possibly, we will see greater social mobility. But while we have what we have, let's make the most of it. Let's use the best that we have available to reach out to those who are out in the streets saying, we want some difference, we want some change, and I think that it's important that we respond to them. So my bottom line is that this is a very, very significant movement that we see in our country, the social movement, but not all of it is good. Some of it can be extremely, extremely dangerous, but rules of engagement, or rules of disengagement, or rules of conflict resolution, or rules of review, and such other rules as are necessary of accountability and transparency, I believe will have to be developed. Whether they are developed by Parliament or by People's Parliament is a question that I leave open. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Khurshid.